So this is a video that is going to review the whole class, and hopefully this is a way to think about what should I take with me after you leave this class and you go into the world, and hopefully apply some of this knowledge. And it's also a way to review for the final exam. And so will be subsequent videos. This first video is kind of an overview, bigger picture perspective of the supply chain class. And so as a reminder, if you think about what did we talk about this semester? Well, we talked about supply chains, but we first started with demand forecasting. So we looked at the customers and how can we predict what a customer will want? How much will they want? When will they want it? And that was an application really of statistics. And that is needed really because if you think about any other decision that we made throughout the supply chain, we needed some sort of demand forecast to inform those decisions. So you can think about that. The next topic we talked about was aggregate planning, coordination, and others. So we thought about how do we determine how much of a resource do we need to plan. And so if you think about manufacturing and saying, okay, I'm going to plan to have this much labor force, this much inventory, this much capacity. How do I figure out what that is? Well, I need a demand forecast to inform those decisions. So we then spent some time there. We also talked a lot in that section about variability, and variability really plays a huge role in all of the supply chain, and it's what makes it really challenging. And we're seeing this right now with COVID-19 is an extreme version of extreme variability in terms of what we expected to happen, both from the demand side and the supply side, have changed radically, which is an extreme version of variability. And that's why we're seeing so many struggles and problems in the supply chain today. Then we talked about inventory models, and you can think about inventory shows up in lots of places, almost all over the supply chain. And so we talked about really how much, where, and when should we get our stuff. And our stuff is materialized in different forms. So closer to a retail store would be a final product, but you would have work in process, you'd have raw materials in different places in the supply chain. And so remember the inventory models we studied, you could apply them directly if you're interested in manufacturing. You could apply the EOQ model, for example, to determine the batch size. So it doesn't just need to be in the context of where we looked at it more specifically in the homework. Then we talked about the network design. So what should this look like? Where should we locate facilities? How should those facilities allocate the resources they have to demand and supply, et cetera? And then we didn't spend as much time this semester on transportation, but we talked about transportation is a component really in network design. So when you think about network design, you could either have lots of facilities and then have lower transportation costs, or not too many facilities and have higher transportation costs. And so we did implicitly think about transportation. We also spent some time thinking about transportation when we studied the centralized versus decentralized inventory models and that trade-off there. And so I've kind of updated a lot of the lecture notes to incorporate transportation more into the lectures, but we didn't have time this time to talk about routing. So if you're interested, the slides and the R code are posted on LMS, but you aren't responsible for any routing questions on the final exam. All right, so when you think about cumulative topics, I mean, I think one takeaway that's true in supply chains, but also in life, is that some people's decision variables are other people's input parameters. So what do I mean by that is, sometimes when we think about topics, we were trying to determine, for example, what is our forecast? So at the beginning of the class, our decision variable was, what is our forecast? How much do we expect demand of a certain product to be? Then as we moved throughout the semester, that became an input parameter. So our forecast then became a piece of data that we assumed we had some estimate for, but we weren't trying to decide anymore. And we used that to make other decisions. And I think that's an important concept to think about in supply chains, but also in life. But if you go to a job and even if you do supply chains, oftentimes what happens is you or your group will be focused on one of these decision variables, and you need to get help input parameters from others. And so An example of that is if you're on an inventory planning team, oftentimes there will be a demand planning or forecasting team. And so what your decisions and what your inputs, they're related, and hopefully the company is using all of this to make a systematic decision. But keep that in mind. So one really big takeaway is that you shouldn't sub-optimize any of these aspects of the problem. Really think about it systematically. And so if you think about the class systematically, what did we do? We optimized a bunch of things. And really we optimized our use of stuff, to be really technical, right? So we had inventory, that's the cost of stuff, right? We had transportation, that's the cost of moving stuff. We had facility cost, that's the cost of operating and storing stuff. And then we had capacity or resource cost, which is the cost of our resources. Those could be labor, equipment, manufacturing, robots, etc., needed to operate and produce our stuff. And so we really want to optimize our use of these resources in a way that minimizes costs or maximizes service. And so if you think about in the COVID-19 days, we want to make sure we get the most ventilators to the people that need it. But there are challenges on all of these levels. We might not have enough inventory, we might not have the capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And so I hope one of the things you take away from this class is that the goal is really to systematically consider all of these things. They have influences on each other, and that's really the idea of optimizing the supply chain. All right, so then what did we do? So we spent some time thinking about designing, planning, and operating a supply chain. So remember, designing is usually long-term strategic decisions. Once you make them, you're stuck with them. Planning is usually a set of policies that govern, next quarter, next year. And then operationally is like, how do I use a specific resource for a specific customer request? And so in this class, we spent most of our time in design and planning, not as much in operations. So when you think about a designing, the main designing question we thought about is network design. So where to locate facilities, that could be factories, warehouse, stores, etc. But once we make those decisions, usually stuck with them for a little bit of time. From a planning perspective, in fact, a lot of the class was on planning, right? So we thought about once we have facilities, how do we allocate demand from them? We thought about ways to buffer against demand uncertainty. We could use inventory, we could use time, we could use capacity or money. We thought about inventory policies, so how much to store where and when to make deliveries. We didn't spend much time on promotions and pricing, but that's another aspect of supply chains. If you're interested in that topic, take some classes in Lally School. We also spent some time on predicting or forecasting demand, and we didn't spend time on handling returns, but that's another aspect of planning. In terms of operating, again, this would be a very specific allocation of a resource. So how do you fulfill Jen's order with the resources I have? That would be an operational decision. Honestly, we didn't spend much time on that. If you're interested, I would encourage you to take a facilities design course, as well as some other courses in our curriculum. All right, so what makes all of these questions hard is really uncertainty, but other things. And I think if you're paying attention at all to the COVID supply chain implications, what makes supply chain management hard is because there's a network, there's lots of moving parts, which means if one part doesn't work, that has implications to other parts that even could be working. It's global, so it adds a ton of complexity. And really at the heart of it, it's about uncertainty and variability being the villain. We have variability in demand and delivery times and delivery quantity and capacity and quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think COVID-19 is a really, really, unfortunately, good example of the impact of extreme variability on supply chains. We have extreme changes in our demand patterns. And that then influences the fact that we have some places in the supply chain have too much stuff and some places have not enough. We have had crazy uncertainty in our capacity. If everyone has to stay home, they can't produce. And so we have different capacity, we have different needs, we have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, unfortunately, I think COVID-19 is a really good example of what happens when variability kind of gets to the extreme level and our economy is suffering for it. So, and so when you think about big picture supply chain decisions, you could think about all the homework and all the modulars that we went through are really different levers. So I can change my network design, I can change my inventory strategy, I can change how I plan my resources through aggregate planning, or what type of mode of transportation I use. Those are all things I get to change and I get to optimize. I get to say, I'm gonna do it this way or that way, right? And that's great. And you now have the tools to think about how to do that. But one of the things before you go do that, you should really think about what are you really trying to achieve. And so going back again to the very beginning of class, we talked about your supply chain decisions should really align with your company's competitive strategy. And so if your company is supposed to be responsiveness, you will have a different network design. You know, a good example of this is Amazon. They have a million, well, not really a million, but they have tons and tons of locations because they want you to get your stuff in a day or 2 days. Versus you could think about a low-cost provider. They're not going to have as many facilities. They might not have as much demand built up, but they are willing to give you a cheaper price, but not as good of service, right? And so it's really important. You now have all these tools and abilities to make these decisions. Remind yourself of what type of decision do you want to make? What is your objective function? Is it to maximize responsiveness or to minimize cost, or somewhere in between that trade-off? And so when you think about the major course topics, you could also think about those as different levers, right? So you can think about using analytical tools, using statistics and data to improve your demand forecasting. You can use optimization to figure out how should I plan my resources so that it can meet my demand. You can think about how do I want to buffer against variability. Variability is always going to exist, but you as a decision maker have the ability to decide how you want to buffer. And if you can be smart, and one of the main ways to be smart is to reduce variability, you can have less buffers for the same level of service. Inventory, you can have different ways and amounts of inventory, and you can have different network design, which is where your facilities are located and how their resources are allocated. You can also think about transportation planning. Again, we didn't talk much about this. You can think about how would I like to transport my goods? Do I want to use air, freight, truck, etc., etc.? There won't be questions about that explicitly on the final exam. There would be transportation questions when we talk about things like centralizing inventory and we ask to calculate the total logistics cost, or in network design, like in the last homework you just did, but not explicitly about selecting modes of transportation. So if you think about supply chain management, it's all about trade-offs, right? So you can have higher inventory, which is bad from a holding cost perspective, but it's good from a customer response. It reduces stock out. So if I go to the store, there's a higher chance what I want is there. And it has the potential to lower transportation costs because you are closer sometimes to the customer, depending on your inventory strategy. You could use cheaper but slower transportation. That's good for your transportation costs, but it could be bad for your inventory costs, because if you think about the lead time in inventory models, which is the time you place an order to when it shows up, that is directly influenced by your transportation mode. You can also think about having more facilities. That increases responsiveness, but increases cost of your facilities and holding costs. So what am I putting up here is the answer to a supply chain question is never a straight yes or no answer. It is not always best to have a lot of facilities or a few facilities. It's not always best to have cheap transportation or slow or fast transportation. The answer is, it really depends. It depends on what are you trying to achieve as a company, what are your cost structures, what are your demand requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I hope you take out of this class are that you have the toolkits to make these trade-offs, to quantify these trade-offs, and then to inform your decision-making. And so the goal is really about informing decision-making, not saying the answer is always 5, okay? And, you know, that's a good trade-off philosophy in life too. So I like this quote by Mr. Hunt: decide what you want, decide what you are willing to exchange for it, establish your priorities, and go to work. And so that's really what our optimization models are doing. We get to decide what is our decision variables, what are we willing to change, establish our priorities, that's our objective function, and then try to do that the best we can. And so hopefully you take this away from supply chains and in life. All right, so on the final exam, there are some kind of bigger picture questions. On the conceptual exam portion, there are multiple choice true or false and some essay questions. And so I think it is important to think a little bit more broadly about the class. So step away and not just think this is homework 1, this is homework 2, this is homework 3. What about the whole class? And so most of the time in the past, students have done really well on this part of the exam. But if you're a little bit rusty or you're a little bit nervous about this, in the textbook, chapter 3 is actually pretty good for this, as well as just thinking about all the things I just said. And I mean, there is a relationship between all of these topics. And so getting maybe in your head a mind map of what is this relationship would really help.